right? But it was a very long call, an hour and 20 minutes of conversation. They talked about everything. Lula said it was a very friendly conversation, and it already brought some results, as you'll see next, right? Lula calls Trump and proposes resuming negotiations on tariffs. That was the most important point of their conversation, the tariffs. Lula said, look, Trump, they're giving you the wrong information. You're putting tariffs on Brazil based on wrong information they're giving you. They're misleading you. That's what Lula said. That's him. Of course, giving that little jab at Marco Rubio. And then Trump said, no, let's open negotiations then. Let's start talking again. Look at that. Lula tells Trump that Brazil doesn't need a classification to fight organized crime. They also talked about that issue of classifying criminal organizations as terrorist organizations, right? And Lula said, to fight crime, we don't need that change because we're already doing the work of fighting it here, right? What they discussed after months without speaking, since May they hadn't spoken. Since May, this is from BBC News Brazil, right? That was when Lula was in the United States. He got the red carpet treatment and the presidents had lunch together, right? There was all that fawning and all. After that, it was nothing but attacks, and then Flávio met with Trump. And then Trump started signaling tariffs, started to attack the Brazilian government. Marco Rubio, even more than Trump, actually, right? And they still hadn't spoken since May, and now it's already August, almost September. And then Lula decided to take this initiative, which led to the main result, which is this right here. After a call between Trump and Lula, ministers from Brazil and the United States resumed trade talks. The United States Secretary of Commerce, which here in Brazil corresponds to the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, called his counterpart here in Brazil, Minister Márcio Elias Rosa, to talk. And he said, look, Trump told us to reopen negotiations, so let's talk, right? Reopening negotiations with the United States is great news because we are losing out with this tariff situation. And it's also a way to get it into Trump's head, or at least try to, right? Because the guy is unpredictable, but to try to get it into Trump's head that Lula is not a threat to the United States. Quite the opposite. Lula always got along well with the United States. In fact, he got along better with the Republicans than with the Democrats, believe it or not. He was very close to George Bush, right? And not so close to Obama, because Obama did some shady things too. So just so you have an idea, he got along well with the Republicans. So once again, this conversation has now brought results. Trump, right? We can expect anything from him, including nothing, including the Datafolha poll. Lula scores 39 in the first round, and Flávio Bolsonaro has 33%. This poll just came out. It's been less than half an hour since it was released by Folha de São Paulo and Globo News, right? So look, in the first Datafolha poll after the official start of the presidential campaign and the registration of the candidates, Lula scores 39 and Flávio Bolsonaro 33 in the first round. In the second round, the PT candidate leads with 20%. So here's the thing. Lula had 40%, dropped to 39%. Since it's just 1 point, it doesn't even count as a drop. It's just a fluctuation because it's within the margin of error, and within the margin of error, it's not a drop. So it's practically as if he were stable. He was at 40%, now he's at 39%. Flávio had 33%, still has the same 33%. So there's a difference of 6 percentage points. It was 7, now it's 6 percentage points, a difference above the margin of error in the first round. In the second round, they are tied within the margin of error, which is plus or minus 2 percentage points. At the limit, both can have 45%. At the limit, it's the most remote possibility, but it exists, right? In the second round, Lula has 47%. He had 48%. Flávio had 43%, still has 43%. So the same thing happened. Lula slipped a point compared to Flávio Bolsonaro, but he's still in the lead. So that's it. We're seeing that things had been shifting in Flávio's favor, but then his rise leveled off, and Lula also stopped dropping. So that's a good sign for Lula's campaign, which has been taking a beating because of this whole Lulinha story. Impressive. Motorim, that's Paulo Motorim, a journalist who used to be at Intercept and is now at ICL, right? The expert admits he didn't compare Dark Horse's expenses with market prices, because Flávio said, no, we've already accounted for it. What came up? There's an expert report on the movie saying the movie cost 75 million. What kind of report is that? First, the report was commissioned by the movie's own production company. So the expert report is already suspicious, right? Because it's an interested party in the story that's paying for it. Second, they didn't compare, for example, if the fees were market value, if the amount paid to the extras was market value, if the costumes cost the market value. Because the guys could have overcharged the whole thing to divert some of the money, right? So he admitted, Paulo Motorinho, talked to the guy who performed this expert review, and he said, no, my expert review was just to find out if there was public money in the movie. Since the money came from Banco Master, it wasn't public money. He said that, but it is public money, because it's money from retirees and pensioners from various places in Brazil, right? But he said, no, I was only hired to do that. So this audit doesn't mean anything at all. There's no financial accounting at all. And Flávio Bolsonaro will keep being asked to explain what he did with 61 million reais that he received from Daniel Vorcaro, the biggest scammer in Brazil. He will have to explain that very clearly, right? Anyway, Lava Jato prosecutors are suspected of leaking information from the Lulinha case. According to Veja magazine, sources from the federal police say Veja magazine published the article yesterday, let's say the most complete one about the case, the biggest article about the case, but it's still not complete because it's still talking about fragments, right? But anyway, what happens? Paulo Goni, Brazil's Attorney General, has 5 prosecutors in his office who used to be part of Lava Jato. In other words, 5 prosecutors who hate Lula. They hate him with all their might. And now the federal police suspects that it was these guys, because they also have access to the investigation information, that it was these guys who leaked it to the press, who have been systematically leaking this information to the press, right? Including the leak that was made to Veja magazine, which was the one that published the most complete article about the story. So like Paulo Goni, who was appointed by Lula, but he's conservative, called these Lava Jato guys, these guys we already know cheated in the previous case, right? In Lula's case, already. Yeah, dirty tricks to convict Lula and take him out of the 2018 election. Now, those guys are there in the Attorney General's office. You'd think they were punished for what they did in Operation Car Wash, right? Not at all. They weren't punished at all. They're there in the office of the boss of the Federal Public Prosecutor's Office. And then the suspicion of the federal police, since the federal police are the ones who will investigate, who will gather the data and find out who leaked it. And when they find out who leaked it, this person who's leaking, if it's just one person, right? It could be more. Anyway, they will be held accountable according to the law. And it's a breach of official secrecy. That's the name of the crime the person committed. And they will pay. They could even be expelled. If it's one of the prosecutors, expelled from the public prosecutor's office. If it's a federal police officer, expelled from the federal police. That can happen. And they could even do time, go to jail, depending on the situation. So let's wait and see, because everything indicates that the leak was done by people who hate Lula and have hated Lula for years. This Lava Jato crowd doesn't stop. It's impressive how they just don't stop.